In this lecture, we're going to talk a little bit about plants and how plants affect humans as well as how humans affect plants. And we have a few images here. We'll come back to the first two. This third image just shows bananas growing on a tropical banana tree, and obviously food is one resource that we get from plants. So in this lecture, we'll first talk about services plants provide to people. These services include nutrition, wood and fiber products, drugs and pharmaceuticals, and ecosystem services. Then we will talk about how people affect plants. We'll talk very quickly about cultivation, harvesting, habitat management, and the involvement of people in moving plants between areas. So let's start with services plants provide, and the first one was nutrition. So nearly all food that humans and other animals consume originates as plant material. So, for example, we might eat a vegetable like corn, but also any meat or dairy that we eat originates from animal material, but those animals in fact grew by eating plant material. So, for example, corn might be consumed by cows, and then we might eat either a dairy product or beef itself. So, because plants are the base of the food chain, plants provide us nutrition. One way is in the form of energy, which we typically think of in units of calories. So, why do our calories come from plants? It's because plants perform photosynthesis, which allows them to capture solar energy and store it in chemical form. Animals cannot do this trick, so plants are the base of the food chain. That means that nearly all of our energy comes either directly or indirectly from eating plants. Here's a couple of examples. 1 ear of corn is giving us about 80 calories. 1 hamburger gives us about 210 calories, but remember, the cow got those calories from eating either corn or some other plant product. So not only do we get energy from plants, plants also provide the substances that are the building blocks of our cells. Animals are able to create some molecules, but most of the atoms that make up the molecules in animals, in fact, come from plants. The only exceptions to that would be water molecules. Well, the only major exception is water molecules. So animals are unable to create some molecules and must acquire them directly or indirectly from plants. So there's some things that animals are able to make by breaking down plant material and then rebuilding molecules. Other things we have to consume directly from the plants themselves. And these are called essential nutrients. These are nutrients that are required for health that humans or other animals are unable to create, so they must be in our foods. Examples of these are some fatty acids, some amino acids, and amino acids are used to form proteins, and also vitamins fall into this category. So plants provide us nutrients directly. Going back to the corn example, we are getting some lipids or fat from corn. We're getting carbohydrates, sugars, and also more complex carbohydrates directly from corn. We're getting protein. We think of protein as coming from animals, but plants themselves have protein. And then also we can see we're getting a couple of vitamins from corn. You can see that the levels are fairly low. As vegetables go, it's a little bit less nutritious. If we look at hamburger, we're getting, again, fat from hamburger, but this fat is coming from either carbohydrates or from lipids that the cows consumed. We're also getting a lot of protein if we eat meat. But where did this protein come from? Remember, it actually came from the corn or the other plant material that the cows ate. And then the cows just concentrated it such that there's more protein in a hamburger than there is in an ear of corn, for example. So overall then, both energy and nutrients mostly arise directly or indirectly from plants. So how are plants able to capture all of this energy and these nutrients? Well, the process of photosynthesis is what provides and nutrients to plants. It's also what allows plants to release oxygen into the air. So photosynthesis, of course, is powered by sunlight. And you can see that in our diagram here. You see rays of sunlight coming down and hitting the leaves of this plant. In the process of photosynthesis, plants capture carbon dioxide and they release oxygen. We'll talk about that in much more detail as the course goes on. The end result of the process is that plants create sugar. Sugar is important because it stores energy. And plants then use those sugar molecules to build other molecules. So they are part of the building blocks for fats and other lipids. They're also part of the building blocks for proteins. Plants also provide us with other things besides nutrition. They provide us with wood and fiber products. There's many examples, but here are a few. So we have a bamboo wood floor, we have a house, and you can see that the house is being constructed almost exclusively of wood. We have hemp rope. Hemp is hemp gives us a fiber that is long and strong and able to make rope. We also get fibers from flax plants that give us linen, which is often used for things like napkins or tablecloths. Some other plant fibers include the fibers that we use to make paper. Cotton is made from a plant fiber, and we've talked about the others. Plants are sources of medicines. So some medicines are really just extracts of plants. Other medicines are developed from taking chemicals that are in plants and then making small modifications to them to make even more effective medicines. And we think of this as a historical idea, but even today, many new medicines are still derived from studying the chemicals in plants and then figuring out how they can affect humans. Here's just one example. We see aspirin pills up in this photograph. Well, aspirin is very closely related to a compound that is found naturally in the stems of willow trees, such as this tree shown here. So not only do we get actual medicines from plants, but a variety of chemicals that are used by humans to alter their mental states come from plants. And some of these maybe are for better, some of these are probably for worse. But we should still appreciate that these are all from plant materials. So here are some examples. Nicotine, which is pictured down here, is from tobacco plants. Morphine is extracted from opium poppy plants. Cannabinoids, such as THC, come from marijuana plants. Cocaine comes from coca plants. And wine, beer, and other alcoholic drinks are derived from plant material that then go through a process of fermentation in which microbes produce the alcohol. So, to the extent that society needs to make decisions about drugs, we need to understand that the precursors of most of these drugs are in fact plant materials. So switching our focus a little bit, we can think about some ecosystem services, some things that plants do for us on a large scale to make our environment more livable. Let's start with the process of erosion. Erosion is the loss of soil due to movement of soil either by water or by wind. And erosion is a problem for a few reasons. First, nutrients and water can be stored in soil. So when we lose soil, that's bad for the agricultural potential of a land area. Also, when we have erosion on a large scale, such as a whole hillside sliding down, that's referred to as a landslide. And here's a picture of a landslide that occurred after an earthquake in Haiti. Landslides can be devastating, especially if there's any housing or other human habitations or structures beneath the landslide. So they can both cause destruction and loss of life. Finally, erosion can be bad because soil runoff, when it leaves an agricultural field, for example, it goes somewhere. It usually goes into a water body. And in that water body, it can cause a number of problems because of the nutrients that are added, or even just because it causes the water to become less clear and less good for the organisms living in it. So erosion is bad. Plants then are important because they help us control erosion and dust. How do they do this? Well, they slow the movement of water and wind across the surface of soil. Also, roots that are in soil help keep the soil in place, even if there are forces that are trying to move them. And vegetation can capture particles of soil as it moves toward water and help keep that soil out of waterways. So in this upper picture, we see dune grass, a particular species of grass that grows along sand dunes, and it helps keep that sand in place so it doesn't blow away. Down here we see a buffer along a stream. So there's a stream passing through here, and you can see that there's this sort of weedy area on both sides of the stream with a few shrubs and trees that is not being used for agriculture. That is going to reduce the amount of erosion that ends up in the waterway and help keep the waterway a slightly healthier place. Another ecosystem service provided by plants is that plants store carbon. So carbon dioxide, or CO2, is a gas that accumulates in the atmosphere and causes warming. We'll talk about that in more detail later in the semester. Both living plants and dead plant remains contain carbon. So if the carbon is stored in plants, then there's less carbon available to become carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Our fossil fuels, whether coal or oil, are derived primarily from plant material. So dead plants that accumulated in earlier geological eras slowly transformed over time into either coal or oil deposits. That means a lot of carbon is stored in that coal and that oil. This means that when we burn plant material, one effect of this is that it releases energy. That's usually why we're burning it, whether to power a factory or whether to heat a habitation. But in addition to that release of energy, we also get a release of carbon dioxide. That carbon dioxide then goes into the atmosphere, which has the potential to cause additional warming of the atmosphere. So that is several ways that plants affect people. Most of the ways were benefits. We now can also think about how do people affect plants. The first category we'll think about is cultivation. And by cultivation, we will think about management of the environment to allow growth of desired organisms for humans' benefit. So what do we do when we cultivate plants? Well, one aspect of this is breeding plants. We select for plants that have traits that we like. We preferentially keep them around so they increase in number. So we in fact have some control over the genetics of plants through this process. We also manage soil fertility. So we do things like turning soil in the field or adding fertilizers to keep the soil fertile, to keep it well suited to growing plants that we want. We, rem- we remove competing plants. So usually, especially in agriculture or in gardening, there are some plants that we want and some plants that are going to also try to grow in that field and use the water or nutrients. By the process of weeding, or sometimes by the process of applying herbicides that kill weeds, we are able to remove those plants. That then leaves more nutrients behind for the plants that we want. We also control plant pests. On the scale of gardening, we might do this by physical removal. For example, collecting beetles and moving them out of the garden. On the scale of agriculture, we often do this by spraying some sort of pesticide that will limit those pest populations. That then allows the plants that we desire to grow better. Finally, we have to harvest plants that we're cultivating. So we have to find ways of collecting their seeds or leaves or whatever parts are desirable. Continuing on this idea of harvesting, we do harvest cultivated plants, and that could be something like reaping corn or wheat or apples or grapes from fields. But there's also continuing practices around the world of collecting wild plants. So an experience you've probably had at some point is picking wild strawberries or raspberries or blackberries. People also still collect nuts commonly, and in many parts of the world, people still collect plant parts for folk or traditional medicine. This has the potential to impact the plant populations, especially if they're harvested at non-sustainable rates. And so to the extent that it's desirable to be able to do this, then it's a practice that has to be managed to make sure that the plant populations can persist. Here's just one example. This is ginseng. There's one ginseng species that occurs in Asia and another one that occurs in Eastern North America, and both are used in traditional Chinese medicine. As a result, the ginseng plants are increasingly rare, and there are protective measures in some parts of the world. So how else do people affect plants? Another way is habitat management. This refers to when we do things to natural areas to maintain desired ecosystem types. So an ecosystem is the collection of organisms as well as the physical environment. Or we might be trying to manage more specifically some individual plant or animal species. And there's a whole bunch of ways that humans manage their environment. So one way is burning, and here's a picture of a controlled burn where the managers are trying to keep an open habitat and prevent forest from growing in. So on some periodic time period, maybe every few years, they start fires to kill young trees and keep the area relatively unvegetated or just vegetated with small shrubs. We can also mow, and this is often used on prairies, or we can graze. We can graze native herbivores like buffalo, or sometimes we just graze non-native things like cows. We can remove unwanted organisms, so we can pull weeds by hand, or we can introduce pests of those weeds to try to control their population. In some areas, we just have to control access because people are likely to either remove plants or to trample on plants. And so we set some areas aside such that the plants can grow without damage. And then finally, we can restore areas. This typically involves bringing in seeds or sometimes bringing in plants to actually plant into an area to create an ecosystem or to reestablish a population in some area where it has been removed. Finally, people can affect plants by moving them. So most plant seeds disperse nearby the parent plant. What I mean by nearby varies from species to species. For some plants, this could be just a few centimeters. For other plants, this could be on the scale of kilometers or miles. But most plants are not able to disperse their seeds over hundreds or thousands of miles. The result of this is that plants do not move very much across mountains, across oceans, or across other large inhospitable areas. It might happen very rarely over long time periods, but it's very infrequent. So a consequence of this is that different geographic areas, like let's say North America compared to Europe compared to Asia, they tend to have different plant species. However, over the last few hundred years, as humans have become better at moving between geographic areas, first with shipping and now with flights, humans have increasingly, either intentionally or unintentionally, moved plants across long distances. The result is that non-native plants, plants from elsewhere, often become introduced into a new area. Many of these plants are harmless or even desirable, but there's also many cases where these plants cause harm, either to agriculture or by taking over natural areas. And so this is an area of active research for management. How do we prevent unintentional movements, and what do we do about plants when they are unintentionally moved? And here's just one example. This is privet. There are several species of privet, which is a shrub. If you remember, Harry Potter lived on Privet Lane somewhere in the UK. It's been brought over several species to North America because it has a desirable look for shrubbery around buildings, but it has escaped and now taken over millions of acres in forest understories around the east of the United States. So over the course of the semester, we are going to talk about plants, and we will try to come back to these ideas that plants both have a lot of importance for people, and people have a substantial ability to affect plant populations and communities. So to emphasize this, I'm going to point out that most land that is suitable for agriculture or forestry has been modified by humans. Now, exactly what modified means is a little bit unclear, and depending on the definition, people say that 80 or even 95% of terrestrial land that is suitable for use has been modified. So what's the importance of this? Well, for one thing, it shows us the centrality of plants for human needs. Given that plants cover most of those areas, humans have done a lot to control what plants grow where. It also shows that humans have substantial abilities to control the abundance and distribution of plants. So we're able to make decisions about what grows where, sometimes better than others. Finally, understanding plant biology allows humans to improve our decision making about cultivation, about harvesting, about management, and about movement to help us better to achieve our goals. So to the extent that we want to make the world a better place for humans, it's important for us to be able to understand the plants that live here too.